Good afternoon. Thank you very much. First and foremost to APA for inviting me, Rafael Diaz Balart, and of course to the Port of Cartagena and Captain Alfonso Salas, who has always been a visionary leader in the world of ports in the Caribbean. I also want to extend my greetings and appreciation to someone I care about who is here and is my mentor at the Secretary of the Association of Caribbean States. He was past Secretary of the Association, Mr. Alfonso Munira, Professor Munira. Thank you very much. Well, to talk about the Greater Caribbean, many topics have been discussed here which are pertinent and truly should serve as grounds for what I'm bringing to this presentation. In the first place, Greater Caribbean for us is the large neighborhood where we all are. We're talking a lot here about globalization, about the way how transportation has evolved, the crises, the pandemic, how the supply chains were affected, the logistics chain. But at the end of the day, I have not heard anyone talk about the neighborhood, the barrio. The Greater Caribbean for me is the neighborhood or the borough. But let me talk about what the association is very quickly. For us to see that the Greater Caribbean is our closest neighbors, and our closest neighbors who throughout our entire history have shared many things in common. That Greater Caribbean we're referring to, which is under the Secretariat of the Association, includes different groups. One of them is precisely Caricom, which perhaps is the most known, which includes the majority of the English-speaking countries. The countries in Central America, many of them present here. And when I talked about CARICOM, I did not see many present here. The group of the three, of which one of the most important ones is Colombia. Here we have Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela. The group of the non-grouped, it sounds a bit awkward, but which ultimately where you find Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Panama. But in addition to this, we have associated members, which are territories, which still are not independent nations, and among them I do see Curacao, some of these territories which are still under some influence of some country in Europe. These are all observing states and observing entities. Among them we can see CARICOM, SILA, which is a first cousin with which we have very good relations, SICA, which is Central America, and ECLAC, which is a very close partner, cooperator since the association began, which is also present here. So we have observer associations, and here I must say that at the Secretariat we are presently signing MOUs. For instance, we just signed one with IDB and with UNDP, and we will be signing one with CAF, which earlier gave us a presentation. When we talk about focal areas of the association, we see how pertinent everything that has been discussed at this forum is. Here we're talking about trade, transportation, tourism. We're talking about reduction of disaster risks. We're talking about climate change. All of these topics have been discussed, and it is precisely our job at the Secretariat to do something that was mentioned earlier today, which is to see how the countries, not just simply the private sector, not only the port authorities, but also the countries establish public policies and develop the plans that will allow them to indeed integrate trade, transportation, risk reduction, climate change, and also digital transformation. which was one of the key tools for this to take place. And regarding the Sustainable Development Goals, the motto and which we have embraced at the Secretariat is that we are all important and nobody should be left behind. This perhaps is not so clear because many times at the countries we look at this individually, but when we look at it regionally or globally, then we can see that at least in these circumstances of crisis, we do things in a solidary manner and everyone solving a common issue. Otherwise, we won't be able to solve it. And here I would like to add something that I heard from a Cuban musician that I really like called Polo Montañez, and it is that this happens because those who are ahead won't go far, is those coming behind leave. So this is something we need to take into account. We cannot think any longer individually in problem solving because when your neighbor has not solved them, eventually that will overflow, as we are seeing now with this delicate or very sensitive issue of migration, because we have a discontinuity, that region that is so heterogeneous in all aspects, and that evidently these circumstances will then pass through other countries through migration and will also generate the social issues that we all know. So let's look a bit about the importance of the Greater Caribbean to see that it has a very large potential. We're talking about, in the case of the association, of this number of member countries, which are 25, but let's also look at the population they represent. And we cannot think that this is something small. We are an important region from a population standpoint and from an economic standpoint. So we need to look at how we can work together. But like I said, this is an association that brings countries that are heterogeneous together, in the sense that there are some very poor nations, others that are in the middle, others have mid to high income, and others of high income. So we have to somehow figure out how to have a compensation chamber from the point of view of solidarity and support in getting behind. Because we have a region that from the get-go has experienced very serious issues in its history, one that has fallen in the trap of productivity, in the sense that we have low technological sophistication, low integration in the global value chains, and predominantly in SMEs, which is not bad, but provided SMEs work within clusters, which ultimately to our chains and to the global chains. The social vulnerability trap that accompanies all of our countries where we have a vulnerable middle class. And under these circumstances of the pandemic, this middle class is the one that has suffered most. And here is where we start to see serious issues in maintaining social peace. The main asset that any country has is social peace. So we also have the trap of the low institutional capacities by the governments, which have to do with weak technical, cooperative, and political capacities of the public institutions, low morale, low tax morale, and weak fiscality, and the environmental trap. We have structures and productive processes with high carbon emissions, depletion of natural resources, and low technology. But from a logistics standpoint, we have a big challenge because it is a very widespread region, and where the only means of connecting these regions and these countries is the sea. We then need to pay special attention to logistics and maritime strategies that allow us to reach that connectivity, because at the end of the day, the market is the one that usually dominates in the shipping industry and determines certain countries only looking for profitability. Many of these countries simply are not visited with shipping lines with sufficient frequency. It is a region that's full of ports. Here at XXIX, I know when I've done analysis, I say there's a surplus of ports, surplus of port capacity, but it is precisely because each of these countries, large, medium, or small size, has its own aspirations of improving trade through the development of infrastructure. As I said, they all want to be queens. In this case, they all want to be hubs. But that cannot be. There will only be a hub where there is sufficient demand and indeed there's a strategic location. So we need to devise a logistics strategy where those that are going to be hub develop as best they can the capacity to be in hubs and the rest to operate with adequate capacities for their respective demands. We have lines that attend this sector, but their main purpose is to handle imports of this region because this is what we practically see. It's are imports coming from the United States mainly to be distributed throughout this region and almost always with an issue of direction. In the majority of the services come in a single direction, so it's very difficult for there to be connectivity between the countries, intra-regional connectivity, because the shipping lines are not providing the service in the opposite direction. And there's very few countries and demand are the ones that are servicing the larger shipping lines, and from that standpoint they are indeed those who are called to being the hubs. This type of understanding has to be made known through this maritime and logistics regional strategy. But we presently have a crisis, the crisis that has been hindering the lives, family, social, professional lives of everyone. And in this crisis, we see a new strain. And this new strain, indeed, everybody's analyzing whether the vaccine we have is going to be sufficient to be protected against this. So while this vaccine issue is not resolved, everything we talked about, trade, about recovery, tourism, etc., all that is on hold because the supply chain goes up and down and generates all these congestions due to the shocks generated by the closing of a country. The economic closing of a country results in bringing much more cargo at a certain time, and that was going to allow us for a continuation of the crisis. The main effect we have already seen in terms of trade. We heard from XXIX talking about a forecast saying that soon we will see an improvement, and I reiterate, the improvement will solely depend on us not closing our countries again. In terms of container and container movement, the same. We have seen a massive decrease in container movement regionally, except at hub ports or transshipment ports. In fact, transshipment has increased, and there's a rationale behind it because where there is no direct service with sufficient density for maintaining a large vessel, then they will have to do transshipment and distribute to a smaller ship. But one key effect the pandemic has had in the entire region is an increase of public debt. And indeed, this is associated to a reduction of fiscal revenues of all the countries. So what we're seeing is weakened countries from a financial standpoint to undertake investments. And here's where we need to think creatively and to find a way that through a PPP mechanism, which was mentioned during BID's and CAF's presentation, we can make those investments. But for this, the countries need to have uniform regulations.
And we also know that countries are addicted to just reporting to the bigger countries, and that really hinders the development of the region. We have a region in which only 10% is the interregional trade moving amongst the ports. There are two key elements here which I would like to mention. One of them is the fact that globalization was geared towards establishing the productive plant in China, and that globalization geared towards production in China has two problems. Each year, it's more difficult to plan it, and from that standpoint, that's why we have ports congestion and also emissions. So these two problems give rise to opportunities at the regional level in order to develop what we have mentioned, nearshoring, nearsourcing, in order to bring this productive capacity to the region. Because what happened in the supply chains, where many products were wasted, and they have given rise to the shocks which have been mentioned regarding freight cost. UNCTAD has said that we're going to have a severe problem for the coming years. This is not going to be sorted out in the short term. I have mentioned the tourism-related topic. Perhaps this is what has suffered the most, because here we had all the crisis elements that affected. It was like the perfect storm. And we saw this from the social, environmental, and political standpoints related to health, and now with technology, with the cyber attacks, and also economics. So the tourism industry, in order for it to recover, and we heard about this with the cruise lines, it's not going to be easy to recover, and it's not going to recover as expected by many. This is a graph that you've seen before, and that is the impact to the region when it comes to tourism for the Caribbean. And all that depends mainly on vaccination. And this is a recent graph of the way in which now, or the status of vaccination. This has increased, not that significantly. We still have a disparity here, because the problem stems in the disparity. Where do you have the new strain, where you have many people who have not yet been vaccinated? So we are going to continue receiving waves of different strains just because of that, because there is no the proper distribution of vaccines in a homogeneous manner. I'm just going to refer to the bottom of the slide. The origin of the problem is one that we all know. However, the solutions in which we must focus, it's the development and implementation on competition regulation. What the United States has been done with the Federal Trade Commission, and what Europe is doing, what Asia is doing, these are measures that must be put in place from the regional standpoint, because at the end of the day, what we are seeing many times in this thing is speculation, price increases, which at the end of the day do not really have the support. For example, service contracting for SMEs, there are companies that have decided to charter a ship, and amongst the solutions that we are considering that we must put in place is to do something on that side. UNTAD on December 15th is going to hold a very important meeting around these topics. And at the end, we have the digital transformation that has been covered here many times. But when we see how are we doing at the country level, we see a huge disparity here. We have talked about what we need to do at the ports level. We have talked about trade And we have also talked about customs. Where is the rest of the supply chain when it comes to the official part, to the government part? So actually, what we are talking about in the association is to increase the level of the country, so what Carlos Urdiola said could be attained. And what was previously said, for all the platforms to be homogeneous. So, I mean, it's useless for one port to do something and then another port finds sexy to do something else. So regional integration faces many difficult challenges, and I'm including here the risk, and you can take a look at them in the presentation. It's going to be available. So we are really going to talk about opportunities. The first thing is to strengthen the role of multilateral bodies, because it is in our hands through all the memberships and all the Council of Ministers at the association. We are planning a meeting of heads of states for April, where we are going to show a new action plan with different programs and actions in which each country will be part of this. Logistics and transportation. I mean, looking for economies of scale, because when we have very small countries, we need those economies of scale through the gathering of the demand to promote PPPs for the development of infrastructure and services. And I'm coming to an end. This is an area in which the association is working in order to develop and to innovate. This is the map I previously shared with you, but here we have the natural hubs, because natural hubs follow the routes of the largest shipping lines. So we have those natural hubs in which the ships are moving of the shippers that I previously mentioned. So we have to look for a way to provide services to those areas which do not have that density level. We're working together with XXIX on this, the technical and economic evaluation for the implementation of ferry services in the Eastern Caribbean under the concept of a multinational PPP. It was mentioned by CAF, the concept of a multinational PPP. This is innovation, but what we see here is that we should think outside the box. We need to incorporate in connectivity many of these countries that, given their sizes and their low demand, now they do not have the adequate services. So these are some of the ones that we have analyzed in the short term, but in order for it to become a PPP, we will need to have a convening at the multinational level. That's why we're holding meetings with IDB, with CAF, with BCE, with the World Bank, because we know that in order to do something of this nature, we need something that requires a joint work. We are including everything about the blue economy, because in order to talk about better control of the oceans, and in order to adapt to climate change, then we need to put in place many of these actions in our plan. And then the orange economy theme, which it's very important because this is a multicultural region, but it's a very rich region if you take into account everything that it's in the orange economy, and also with the tourism and circular economies. And with this, I conclude my presentation, because at the end of the day, the main challenge that, and here I would like to congratulate the Port Authority of Cartagena, because they've published this brochure. I'm showing it because I think that all the ports, all the logistic activity should do this type of thing. They should analyze their own work and by also complying with those achievements, which at the end of the day is going to allow for no one to be left behind. And to promote inclusion patterns and responsible and sustainable consumption that will save energy and natural resources based on the rule reduce, reutilize, and recycle. And our strategic objective in the association that we're bringing to that summit of heads of state are aligning these 5 elements, which is recovery and adaptation with respect to climate change. Because what we have ahead of us, it's not only to reconstruct or to rebuild, but to rebuild safer and stronger. Thank you very much.